In this video, I'm going to go through two broad principles I've picked up from my time in mining that I've now applied into my personal finances. Up front, let me just say this is going to be pretty nerdy. If 10 people watch this video, I'd be pretty happy and excited because I know those 10 people got a lot of value out of it. The two principles I want to go through I've labeled as circuit dynamics and risk management. Here we go. However, let me start with a little bit of context just so we're on the same page around my experience in mining. I've worked at 3 mines in Australia. 2 of them I worked in an internship capacity. Now, when you work as an intern on an Australian mine, you're generally just trying to stay alive, not get injured, get some good experience, wake up on time, do the FIFO thing if you're lucky, and learn the basics of mining industry dynamics. I then did spend 3 years at a copper mine on the east coast of Australia, where I probably gained a little bit more broader understanding and actually a little bit more technical understanding of mining. Being a chemical engineer, I worked at the processing plant element of a mine site. So you typically have the mine where you actually get stuff out of the ground, but the stuff you get out of the ground is usually not in a very good state to put on a ship and give to your customers in China or say Japan. So there's a little bit more processing required to get it to a saleable state. And that's what happens in a processing plant. And that's my experience working in mining, and that's where I've picked up some of these tactics and principles I want to share. So the first set of principles I've labeled circuit dynamics - plant operations. Here's what I mean by that. There are 3 key things that is really important when you're working on a processing plant that I think also apply to your personal finances. First of all, understanding the levers. Secondly, the importance of stability. And thirdly, debottlenecking. Now, what do I mean by understanding the levers? If you watched a few of my videos, you would have seen me refer to understanding what are the levers behind this investment style, superannuation, whatever it is. I'm trying to understand what are the things that we can pull as retail investors that might impact our personal finances. So this is important when you're operating on a plant site because there's quite a lot of machines that are working, they're all interconnected, and they all have an impact on how you run your processing plant. And as a processing engineer, it's important to understand what are the levers that are available to you, what can you pull, and how might that impact everything downstream. And understanding your levers also helps you understand what you can control and what you can't control. Just like on a processing plant, things can happen upstream that can impact you, which you can't control. But in the same way, when it comes to your finances, there are things that can happen upstream that you can't really control, but you have to be able to react to, and you know your limitations. The second principle I have is around running a stable circuit. Now, this also applies to your finances, but what I mean in a processing plant is if you've ever worked on a processing plant, they'll often tell you it's really important to have a stable circuit. Everything's running in a very stable environment. Now, stable doesn't mean optimal, but when it's stable, it helps you optimize. Just sounds really nerdy, I know. But because everything's interconnected, machines run at different parameters, it's important to understand if you do something upstream, it can impact things downstream. So try to run in a way where you're not having too much variation in your circuit. Now, there's a few ways you can do this by having great control systems, but another way is also having great buffers in how you run your operation. Meaning, if you have a bit of a surge event, everything downstream can handle it because they're not running right at the top of their capacity. Now, when it comes to your personal finances, it's the same idea. If you can run your operation initially a little bit suboptimally, but you have control. You know how much you're budgeting, you got your spending in control, you're not going to be put off by any major variations in your expenses. Because if you have a sudden bill that's 10%, 20% more expensive, how's that going to impact everything else downstream for the rest of the month or for the months coming up? The third sub-principle I have in this area is around debottlenecking or finding the bottlenecks in the processing plant and in your finances. In a processing plant, if you're running everything pretty stable, at some point someone's going to be asking you, can we do another 10%? Can we put more tonnage through here? Can we improve things a bit more? Where's the limit? What's stopping us from doing more in this processing plant? And a good engineer or a good operations team can tell you, it's this piece of equipment over here. It's this little thing over here. This is the thing that's limiting our rate of production or the quality of our production. Or we can't achieve both if this is the case. So this is really important to also understand when it comes to your personal finances. It's pretty obvious, I know, but what's the thing that's stopping you from achieving your 5-year plan in 2 years? On a mine site, it's pretty straightforward. You identify the equipment, that you need to improve? What's the cost? What's the benefit? Do we make the investment? And what's the downstream impacts of it? Is there something operationally we can do, or do we need capital to invest into this thing? When it comes to your personal finances, identifying the bottleneck, I know this is going to be pretty basic, but let's run through it. It's probably going to be, can you earn more money? Can you spend less money? Or can you get more returns on your investments? It kind of connects back to levers, but understanding these key areas, this is probably going to be your tension point that's stopping you from maybe achieving your 5 or 10 year plan in 2 years. In terms of my costs, can I spend less money? I got to be careful, back to that revenge spending thing. I don't want to cut too much out, but I've probably reached the limit in terms of how much I can necessarily cut out. But when it comes to how much I'm earning, that's definitely an area I can work on to improve, whether it's a higher paid job or finding other sources of income. And the resource I would use to invest into that would be my time and a little bit of my actual money. But the idea is some of my free time I develop into building additional income sources, because that is my current bottleneck right now really is there's not much more money I can save, but can I build additional income, increase my income through other ways by investing my time? What's the benefit cost calculation there? And can I deploy my time in a way to increase my income? Can I just say, if you've made it this far after de-bottlenecking in your personal finances, thank you so much. I appreciate you, and I know I'm adding value in your life. Hopefully. Please leave a comment below to say you've made it this far, because I really do appreciate it. Now, the next area is around risk management. Now, one of the things I've noticed is when it comes to people who've worked in the resources industry, whether it's mining, oil and gas, maybe even manufacturing, or probably even in the defense force, in some kind of setting where the risk is not getting sued necessarily and being on the front page or project execution risk. I'm talking about risk where you're probably going to get injured, potentially loss of life, where you could either lose your life, you could injure yourself, or you could injure someone else. People who have often worked in those industries tend to have a bit of a sophisticated understanding around risk and risk management, risk assessment, all those kind of things, because it's kind of drummed into you from day one. Whereas if you're someone who's maybe worked in other areas of corporate Australia or in other industries, risk may not be something that you're always thinking about because it's not as front and center. And that's fair enough. But one of the things I noticed from working in mining is I had a pretty sophisticated understanding of risk, and I did apply that into my personal life, especially around my personal finances as well. Two key things I'd call out are around risk identification and risk assessment and mitigation. So risk identification, that's pretty straightforward. What are the things that can go wrong in my life and in my personal finances? This is usually where you list it out. End to end, it can be as detailed or as broad as you want, but you list it all out. Then you start considering, what's the assessment of this risk? Now, the classic thing that most people think about when it comes to risk is the risk matrix. So you've got a risk and you're thinking about what's the probability or the likelihood of something going wrong, and what are the consequences if that thing went wrong downstream or on your life or on various other aspects of your finances. So taking my learnings from mining into risk in my personal life, I'm often thinking about what can go wrong, broadly speaking, but also what can really go wrong in terms of my finances. What are the consequences of those things going wrong, and what's the likelihood of those things going wrong? And I think this has been pretty valuable for me because risk doesn't necessarily scare me, because first of all, I need to understand, what are we actually talking about here? What are we talking about going wrong? And what's the likelihood of it actually going wrong? Is it just like a 1 in 100 year event, or is this something that's possibly likely to happen if I don't put some kind of control in place? And I've jumped ahead, but that's what I'm talking about. And the second thing is, if this thing goes wrong, what's the actual consequence? What's the end result of this? And then I'm thinking, okay, what are some of the controls or mitigants I can put in place to deal with this risk? And after I've put those risk controls in place, what are the end results? What's the new risk? Has that actually, genuinely reduced that risk? Or is there still a bit of residual risk remaining? That's a classic line. And in reality, for most people, I imagine the biggest risk is really losing your income, losing your job, something along those lines. So for example, it could be, what's the likelihood of you losing your job? Now that's a really saddening question, but it's also a realistic question. You got to really be asking, are you in an industry where it's very cyclical? Or are you in an industry where it's pretty stable and even in tough times, you've still got a job? consider that, have a mature understanding of what is the likelihood of me losing my job. Secondly, what's the consequence of me losing my job? I know, basic stuff, but if you if you don't have any income coming through, how's that going to impact your life in the various domains that you might have in your life? And what's the controls that you can put in place to deal with them? So the controls can be considered from both the point of view of reducing the likelihood of something happening and also the consequence of if it went wrong, or how can I reduce the consequences of it happening? So, for example, when it comes to your income and the risks around it, there's a couple of things. First of all, in terms of a control you can put in place is obviously your emergency fund. That's really reducing the consequence of it, is your inability to maybe pay your loan, your inability to pay your bills is lowered because even if you lose your job, you've got an emergency fund which you can draw on, and it reduces the fact that you might fall behind in terms of your bills or your loans. Now, the likelihood of you losing your job, again, consider how you can reduce that risk. Do you become indispensable? I don't know. I don't know. In corporate Australia, all sorts of things can happen. People who do a great job, if the role is gone, the role is gone. Doesn't matter how good you are, if the role is now gone and the company's not really in a position to redeploy you into other roles, that's a tricky situation to be in. If you got this far, can I just say again, you're a hero to me. Hopefully you got a lot of value out of it. Please leave a comment below, because this was a bit of a shot in the dark, and I thought hopefully I can add value to people by taking some of my learnings in one industry and applying it into my personal life. Leave a comment below in terms of what you picked up, some things you hadn't considered, and also some of the things that you've picked up in some of your work or your general life that you've now applied into your personal finances. Some principles, some rules of thumb, anything like that. Please do check out some of my other videos around investing and a bit around mindsets. And here's another video from Tim Ferriss around thinking around what can go wrong and what failure might mean, that might help you open up some of these topics around risk management as well. See you in the next video. Bye for now.